enemy planes, undoubtedly Japanese.
I was up in the compartment reading a comic book, and that's when I realized we were under attack.
Buddy, this is the real McCoy. It's the goddamn Japs.
The unprovoked and dastardly attack by Japan, a state of war, has existed.
Can you envision 1 million pounds of TNT blowing up?
I could see the pilot and the co-pilot, and they were laughing for all they were worth. It was horrifying.
"5 a.m., Sunday, 7th December, 1941. Pearl Harbor, Hawaii lay still and quiet. The mighty warships of America's Pacific Fleet were anchored in Battleship Row.
At that time, the Navy, the personnel thought the battleships were the greatest thing going. Nothing could defeat them.
The Oklahoma was outboard, the Tennessee was inboard, the West Virginia was outboard. And right behind us was the Arizona, and then right behind the Arizona was the Nevada.
We're 2 battleships, then 2 battleships, then 2 battleships, all sitting there like sitting ducks.
On air bases, aircraft were tightly grouped to guard against potential sabotage from Japanese sympathizers on the island. Unbeknownst to those at Pearl Harbor, 230 miles to the north, Japanese forces aboard the carrier Akagi were preparing for an attack. As dawn approached, the first wave of 180 aircraft took flight. The fate of Pearl Harbor was sealed. At 6:30 a.m., Navy sailors aboard the anchored warships at Pearl Harbor began their routine, waking up to what seemed like an ordinary Sunday. Unaware of the catastrophe about to unfold, these men went about their duties, oblivious that in mere minutes they would face one of the most devastating and historic battles in American naval history. "15 minutes later, signs began to emerge that this would be no ordinary day. One of the advanced guard Japanese submarines had just been spotted. The USS Ward had been patrolling outside of the harbor when it saw a periscope above the water. The ship attacked the unidentified submarine and sent back notification of the incident to the mainland.
His message, when I broke it down, said, "Sunk enemy submarine 1 mile south of Pearl Harbor." Well, our communications officer, when he looked at that, he was aghast. He was certain they didn't mean sunk a submarine, they maybe meant sighted it.
This vital early warning was neglected. Had the message been relayed properly, aircraft and battleships could have been prepared in advance, and the US Navy could have diverted the catastrophe which would soon unfold. By 7 a.m., the first wave of Japanese aircraft was approximately 130 miles away from Pearl Harbor. The commander of the strike force used music from an Hawaiian radio station to home in on the target. However, by this time, American forces on the ground had spotted the Japanese attackers. One of the men at an army radar post noticed some blips on his radar and alerted military HQ. This was the Americans' final chance to avert disaster, but unfortunately, the intelligence was not taken seriously. At 7:20 a.m., an Army lieutenant disregarded the radar report. believing that it indicated a flight of US planes, possibly B-17 bombers scheduled to arrive that day.
They told them not to worry about it because it was a flight of B-17s coming in from California. Well, when you're approaching Oahu from California, you don't come from the north, you come from the east.
7:40 a.m., the first wave of Japanese aircraft reaches the island of Oahu. The quiet morning was shattered by the roar of planes, and a rush of fear and panic spread across the naval base.
Out of the misty Pacific skies, like tiny locusts, they swarmed in from the sea. From the south. From the southeast.
Without knowing it, a reluctant US would soon be plunged into World War II, forever altering the course of history.
Until December 1941, America is adopting this very kind of tricky policy of staying out the war because domestically, a lot of Americans don't want to be sucked into a conflict they don't think it's got anything to do with them. And at the same time, the American President Roosevelt is keen to help the Allies fight, and by supplying supplies across the Atlantic and also supplying battleships. So there is a very fine line the Americans are having to tread.
If Great Britain goes down, the Axis powers will control the continents of Europe and Asia and Africa and Australasia and the high seas. And they will be in a position to bring enormous military and naval resources against this hemisphere. Thinking in terms of today and tomorrow, I make the direct statement to the American people that there is far less chance of the United States getting into war if we do all we can now to support the nations defending themselves against attack by the Axis than if we acquiesce in the defeat of those nations.
That is all going to change in December 1941, when suddenly, out the middle of nowhere, seemingly, the Hawaiian port of Pearl Harbour is suddenly attacked by the Japanese.
At 7:49 a.m., the first wave's commander ordered the attack on Pearl Harbor to proceed.
I was in bed with a beautiful blonde, my wife. That's what I was doing on December the 7th. All of a sudden, I heard a commotion. By now, my gut had just turned up to a little ball of lead.
6 minutes later, the coordinated attack on Pearl Harbor began. The Japanese dropped bombs, torpedoes, and fired mercilessly at the Pacific Fleet and aircraft bases.
About that time, I began to hear our guns fire. And I mean, they would really fire fast. And they had a lot of guns and more ammunition we could have shot in 1,000 years.
Dive bombers attacked American air bases across Oahu, starting with Hickam Field, the largest, and Wheeler Field, the main United States Army Air Force's fighter base. The men on the air bases tried desperately to fight back, but the close grouping of the planes made them easy targets for the Japanese bombers. Over at Pearl Harbor, around 15 miles away to the west, the Japanese aircraft had America's Pacific Fleet in their sights.
On the morning of the 7th, That was my 3rd anniversary in the Navy, and I was sitting in my bunk reading the paper when they sounded general quarters. The thoughts that went through people's head. What in the world is going on now? Why are they doing a drill on Sunday morning? And they said it in a different manner, you know. They got a little hot-tempered.
When it all started, we kept hearing some thud noises and explosions, but they were deep sounding. They got louder. And I got up, I told my buddy, I said, let's go out there and see what's going on. I said, that sounds big. And looked up there and saw those planes screaming around and saw the big red dot. Well, that's when we realized it was Japanese.
An emergency message was flashed out. Air raid Pearl Harbor. This is not a drill. Unprepared for the attack, the warships had only a minimal power supply. Ammunition from the stores had to be brought up manually by crew. The odds were not in the US's favor, and the Japanese had total domination of the sky.
As I was going up the ladder, a plane came flying right down the port side of the ship, and I could see the pilot and the co-pilot, and they were laughing for all they were worth.
The Americans believed that the water was too shallow for a torpedo attack, but the Japanese had created a brand new kind of torpedo specifically designed for the waters of Pearl Harbor, and it had a devastating effect. By 8 a.m., the USS West Virginia had been hit. The West Virginia was torn apart by 6 torpedoes and 2 bombs. Chaos and confusion soon ensued. The attack on Battleship Row moved at a sudden pace.
Within the first 5 minutes of the attack, 4 battleships were hit, including the USS Oklahoma and the USS Arizona. Minutes later, the Arizona exploded after a bomb hit its gunpowder stores. The ship was sunk, and it took the lives of 1,177.
It was horrifying because as the bomb hit the starboard side of the forecastle deck, it was just a gigantic explosion.
Can you envision 1 million pounds of TNT blowing up?
You had burning oil all over the top of the water, and you had black smoke, and then you had fire in the ship. And so those young kids were trying to jump into the burning water from the mast. Some of them made it, some of them didn't.
By 8:10 a.m., the USS Arizona was in bits. The Japanese had swiftly pulverized Battleship Row. The USS Oklahoma, containing 1,000 men, was experiencing a horrifying fate. The Japanese had fired 3 torpedoes, causing the ship to turn over. Water started to spill through into the interior.
And I looked around, and there was a big whale. I didn't, what on earth is that? That's the Oklahoma. The Oklahoma had capsized, we didn't even know it, and it was right so close I could have hit it with a ball. I felt like somebody kicked me in the stomach with a boot or something, because that's the worst I ever felt the whole war, to see the Oklahoma. You just don't kill a battleship. They're impregnable, tough.
The Oklahoma's hull had been torn apart, and the crew desperately tried to stop the water pouring in.
We took these clothes and the blankets and stuffed them in the vent system to try to stop the water from coming in. Well, we'd plug it up in one place in the vent, then it'd start coming in somewhere else.
More than 30 soldiers were trapped inside the battleship, fighting for their lives. Meanwhile, Kaneohe Naval Air Station was also in flames. But the sailors stationed there attempted to fight back against the Japanese bombardment.
I was angry, so damn mad that I didn't have a sense enough to be afraid. Of course, during this time, I was being wounded because the Japs, they ain't joking, they were there to kill us.
The first wave of attacks was ending. However, one Japanese pilot made a final daring run on the base.
I saw a speck way up there. And boy, he was coming like hell. Then he came boiling out of that smoke. I didn't have to move that gun. I just swung it around and I let him have it.
The air station lay in complete devastation. Charred wreckage of airplanes and shattered propellers were strewn across the landscape, mingled with lifeless bodies. The American troops felt a crushing sense of defeat.
I know some of them cried. Some of them were angry. Some of them just couldn't understand. And none of us really understood why we were hit at that time.
The surprise attack had taken a massive toll. At 8:54 a.m., the second wave of 170 aircraft began their attack. They were separated into 3 groups, focusing in on mostly the same targets. But with the base now on high alert, their plan was less successful. At the airbase and the ships, the Japanese faced a barrage of fire. Resistance was better coordinated.
The sky was very full of planes plus exploding shells. At times, it was just like a flock of birds.
Having devastated Battleship Row over the last hour, Japanese pilots set their sights on the warships moored in the dockyards.
There were 3 airplanes coming down and dive bombers. And these 3 planes dropped their bombs, and I saw them coming, and I started screaming at Stratton. I said, they're gonna get us this time.
The USS Cassin and USS Downs, both destroyers, were heavily damaged during the second attack. Stationed in Dry Dock No. 1 alongside the battleship USS Pennsylvania, they were hit by bombs and engulfed in fires from ruptured fuel tanks. At 9:30 a.m., the Japanese also set their sights on the USS Shore, dropping several bombs on the ship. The spectacular explosion of her forward magazine provided one of the most iconic photographs of the attack. While the Shore burned, another warship, the Nevada, made a break for open water.
As we moved down the channel, the second wave of planes came over, and we were hit by 5 to 7 bombs and many, many near misses. The explosions, we could feel them, and we just were holding our breath, hoping that all went well up there.
Bombs hit the forward and mid-section of the ship. If the crippled Nevada sank, it would block the escape route to the sea. The rest of the ships in Pearl Harbor would be like sitting ducks. The Nevada eventually beached on Hospital Point, escaping the inferno and keeping the vital channel clear. At 10 a.m. on the 7th of December, 1941, the Japanese strike force decided to withdraw, leaving behind a devastated Pearl Harbor. Concerned about potential American counterattacks and the risk of exposing their fleet to greater danger, Admiral Nagumo ordered the retreat. Though the attack was highly successful, key targets like oil storage facilities and shipyards remained intact, which later proved crucial to the US recovery.
Within 2 hours, 21 American warships had been sunk or damaged, 188 aircraft destroyed, and 2,403 US servicemen and women killed. Many of the ships were repaired and fought in later battles, and crucially from the point of view of the United States, all three of the Pacific Fleet's aircraft carriers were not at Pearl Harbor at the time, and so they escaped damage, and this was to prove vital during the later stages of the Pacific War.
And the reason why it was so symbolic and so successful was that America had never been attacked like that on their home shores, especially in the modern era. And it was proof that the Japanese were this highly mechanised force, utterly ruthless, who could commit an act like this you could almost call it terror, of absolute audacity and absolute violence, which had both a very strong military and naval purpose, but also, of course, it basically saw the Americans, who had spent the last couple of years being relatively complacent about the war, about a lot of people thinking, this doesn't bother us, this isn't something that's going to impinge on our backyard, to realising that the war was at hand whether they liked it or not.
During the attack on Pearl Harbor, 68 civilians tragically lost their lives, with the bulk of the casualties being military personnel. A total of 2,335 service members were killed, bringing the overall death toll to 2,403. Many civilian deaths were caused by stray anti-aircraft shells that fell on Honolulu as defenders desperately fired at the incoming Japanese planes. Millions of Americans awoke on the morning of the 7th of December, 1941, to the horrifying news of the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor. The devastating aftermath of the damage sent shockwaves across the country.
Hello, NBC. Hello, NBC. This is KGU in Honolulu, Hawaii. I am speaking from the roof of the Advertiser Publishing Company building. We have witnessed this morning a distant view, a brief battle off Pearl Harbor, and a severe bombing of Pearl Harbor by enemy planes, undoubtedly Japanese. The city of Honolulu has also been attacked and considerable damage done. This battle has been going on for nearly 3 hours. It is no joke, it is a real war.
The scale of the tragedy began to unravel, and President Franklin D. Roosevelt took swift and decisive action. On 8th December 1941, the very next day, he addressed a joint session of Congress, delivering his famous Day of Infamy speech, a show of strength which would go down in American history.
Yesterday, December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy. The United States of America was suddenly and deliberately attacked by naval and air forces of the Empire of Japan. The United States was at peace with that nation, and at the solicitation of Japan, was still in conversation with its government and its emperor, looking toward the maintenance of peace in the Pacific. The facts of yesterday and today speak for themselves. With confidence in our armed forces, with the unbounding determination of our people,
I ask that the Congress declare that since the unprovoked and dastardly attack by Japan on Sunday, December 7th, 1941, a state of war has existed between the United States and the Japanese Empire.
Pearl Harbour, at Hickam Field, in the bomb-pocked streets of Honolulu, ever is written history. History with a tragic, treacherous pen. History that 130 million Americans will never forget. And in days to come, the Japs, too, will remember Pearl Harbour. Here is a tragic, unforgettable page in the annals of America. Here, the cunning deceit of the Japs will never be forgotten. Here, they hoped to score a knockout before the war began. The Arizona's gun crews, battered and broken, fired to the last. Their guns pointed skyward, from whence the enemy appeared.
Pearl Harbor was the worst defeat the United States had ever had. And that dug right deep into every one of them. This cannot happen. Why did it happen? And they all responded in such a strong way.
I guess I really did know that we would win, because when you attack a bunch of Marines and sailors, you're in trouble.
We may lose the battle, but we're going to win the war.
The attack on Pearl Harbor had shattered the peace, igniting a fiery resolve across the nation. As smoke still billowed over the wreckage, the US transformed overnight, gearing up for war on an unprecedented scale. Factories roared to life, soldiers rallied, and the country united under a singular purpose: to strike back with relentless force.
We are going to win this war, and we are going to win the peace that follows. I repeat that the United States can accept no result save victory, final and complete.
Franklin D. Roosevelt led the United States into war in the Pacific with strong backing from both the Soviet Union and Britain.
We cannot tell what the course of this fell war will be as it spreads remorseless to ever wider regions.
Though the Soviet Union was primarily focused on the European front against Nazi Germany, Stalin supported US efforts against Japan, particularly after the US joined the Allies. Winston Churchill and Britain, already deeply involved in the war, were key partners, with both nations coordinating strategies for a two-front war. In response to the surprise attack, FDR swiftly mobilized the military, air force, and navy, with the first waves of American forces being deployed to key Pacific locations such as Hawaii, the Philippines, and other islands soon after. The Japanese military fortified its positions across island strongholds by reinforcing defenses and stockpiling resources, fully aware of the impending clash with the US. Elsewhere, in the West, most of Europe was under Axis control. Adolf Hitler had launched a massive invasion of the Soviet Union. But the spread of his forces did not deter him from also declaring war on the United States on the 11th of December, 1941.
It's one of Hitler's most perplexing decisions as to why he decides to declare war on the United States. But actually his reason for doing it is because he thinks finally this is an opportunity to show that he really wants to rid the world of what he sees as being the evils of international finance and Jewish control of economies. Of course, he's dead wrong about that. He's also in a pact with Japan, so he feels that Japan's a natural ally. And so this is why, war breaks out. It's Hitler saber-rattling. He doesn't know what it's going to lead to.
With Hitler's declaration, the US found itself engaged in a two-front war. The attack on Pearl Harbor had thrust millions of American citizens directly into the heart of the conflict.
It's one thing just to say we're declaring war, but also logistically, This is a really tricky ask for the Americans, if you like. They've got to fight a war in Europe, and they've also got to fight a war around the other side of the planet, all over the Pacific. This is going to require all of America's industrial might and know-how if they can fight a war both in Europe and the Pacific.
Never in the history or the memory of man has there been a war in which the courage, the endurance, and the loyalty of civilians played so vital a part. Many thousands of civilians all over the world have been and are being killed or maimed by enemy action. Our soldiers and sailors and Marines are fighting with great bravery and great skill on far distant fronts to make sure that we shall remain safe. As we here at home contemplate our own duties, our own responsibilities, let us think and think hard of the example which is being set for us by our own fighting men.
The Pacific War turned out to be a brutal and drawn-out conflict, marked by relentless battles across land, sea, and air. Spanning thousands of miles of treacherous terrain, it saw ferocious island-hopping campaigns, massive naval engagements, and devastating air assaults as both sides fought fiercely for dominance in the Pacific.
7 hours on one engine, extra belly tanks, extra nerve and stamina in the cockpit.
When Japan and the United States are fighting this war in the Pacific, what they're doing is fighting for island strongholds. You've got to think of the war as like a kind of to and froing of trying to grab stepping stones on a big pond, if you like. And so, the more stepping stones you control, the more of the pond you control. And so you have huge battles on islands like Iwo Jima, Peleliu, which are very bloody, very attritional fights in which the Japanese are often dug in and fight to the last man. And it costs an enormous amount of lives. So it's a very bloody, very vicious, very drawn-out combat. And of course, as well as these battles on these small islands, you also have these huge naval engagements as well, like the Battle of Midway, which again are very costly in men and material.
The Battle of Midway in June 1942 proved to be a decisive naval battle for the US. Within the first 5 minutes, the American Air Force had hit 3 Japanese aircraft carriers, with a 4th being destroyed by the end of the battle. Midway marked the beginning of a more aggressive American military presence in the region. Japan employed violent and desperate tactics during the Pacific War, including the infamous kamikaze suicide attacks, where pilots deliberately crashed their planes into Allied ships in a final deadly bid to halt the advancing forces. By 1944, the Japanese were using kamikaze pilots regularly in an attempt to turn the tide of the war. These suicide missions, launched primarily against Allied naval vessels, caused significant damage and sank or damaged hundreds of ships, killing thousands of sailors. While terrifying and disruptive, many kamikaze attacks were intercepted by Allied anti-aircraft defenses, and the loss of skilled pilots and planes strained Japan's already dwindling resources. In late 1944, the bloodiest battle of the Pacific Campaign took place on the island of Peleliu. the US 1st Marine Division landed on the island expecting a swift victory. However, the Japanese had changed their defensive strategy. Instead of defending the beaches, they dug into the island's rocky ridges and caves, creating a complex network of fortified positions.
The temperature was around 115 degrees. Now, 115 degrees with high humidity is insufferable to even sit and rest, but to be running around out there in the scorching sun, carrying your load of ammunition and your weapon, or trying to help carry wounded out, it was just absolutely exhausting. You can see Bloody Nose Ridge on the other side. That's where we were going. Places as many as 200 feet high, the Japs had complete, clear vision of everything we did.
The Marines faced heavy resistance right from the start, with intense machine gun and artillery fire from hidden Japanese positions.
They had heavy artillery up there. The concussion from the Jap artillery shells was so loud and so constant that it was like as though the ground was swaying back and forth. And here you were up running through this. You could see guys just falling all around us. That was one of the strangest ways to me that men fell when they were hit. I suppose it depended on what type of projectile or fragment hit them, but some of them just sagged down to the ground. It was almost pitiful, like they were just real tired, and they were dead. And other guys threw their arms out and fell over backwards, and some guys pitched forward, and some let out god-awful screams. To me, that was the worst part of all of seeing guys get hit. Maybe it didn't bother some people as bad as it did me, but you know, every one of those guys was a damn good Marine and a buddy and some other's son.
The island was declared secure after nearly 2.5 months of intense fighting, though scattered resistance continued for weeks. However, fighting in the Pacific would continue late into 1945, with countless more American lives lost. The Allied powers secured victory in Europe in May 1945. The Nazi Empire finally fell after 6 long years, and Hitler escaped to his bunker to die by cyanide. However, for the United States, the war was not over yet. Trouble still brewed in the Pacific, and American blood continued to spill.
After VE Day was declared in Europe, there was a real problem, but America and the rest of the Allied powers were still at war with Japan. And Japan showed absolutely no signs of surrendering. The difference between Germany and Japan was that Germany, especially after Hitler died, knew they were beaten, knew there was nowhere else to go. They just basically had to settle for a humiliating peace, the best possible terms they could get. The thing about Japan is that there is no concept of surrender in their national identity. That the whole idea was that they would literally fight until the last man.
Germany surrendered on May the 8th, and we got the news on a tank radio because we were preparing on Okinawa for a big push on May the 9th. And granted that we were all glad for the troops in Europe and glad for the civilians who had suffered so much. But as far as we were concerned, the general remark that I heard was, so what? Because the next day we had to make this push and my company got all shot up. So, you know, Nazi Germany might as well have been on the moon as far as we were concerned, because we had our hands full of all kinds of trouble where we were.
The Battle of Okinawa took place from April to June 1945. It was the final desperate push in the Pacific theater, bringing the war closer to Japan's home islands. As the largest amphibious assault of the Pacific War, Okinawa was seen as the last major stepping stone for the Allies before a potential invasion of mainland Japan. This brutal campaign, codenamed Operation Iceberg, was marked by fierce ground combat, kamikaze attacks, and heavy civilian casualties. Japanese forces, entrenched in fortified positions, fought tenaciously, leading to a high death toll on both sides. Over 12,000 US soldiers and an estimated 100,000 Japanese soldiers were killed. Thousands of Okinawan civilians also perished, many through forced suicides.
The combat at Okinawa was, in a sense, worse than Peleliu because it went on for 3 months. And when it was over, we were just so utterly exhausted, it's indescribable. I was convinced that if I had had to invade Japan, I would never survive because my luck had run out.
The battle marked the climax of the island-hopping campaign and set the stage for the war's end. The catastrophic losses at the Battle of Okinawa convinced US leaders that an invasion of Japan's mainland would be devastating. With Truman now as president, he weighed up the decision to use atomic bombs to force Japan's surrender and avoid further bloodshed. At 8:15 a.m. on the 6th of August 1945, the lead plane, Enola Gay, released the little boy bomb over Hiroshima. Residents awoke to the most almighty sight in human history. Little Boy fell almost 6 miles in 43 seconds before detonating at an altitude of 2,000 feet. 80,000 people died instantly, some even evaporating on the spot.
A short time ago, an American airplane dropped one bomb on Hiroshima and destroyed its usefulness to the enemy.
You can imagine that if you are in Hiroshima, you're going about your daily business, there's just this flash of blinding white light, and then all of a sudden everything around you is destroyed. And it is something biblical. I mean, you would have genuinely imagined, if you'd seen it, that this was the end of days. Japan at this point was faced with the fact that one of their major industrial and military bases no longer existed. I mean, a huge number of civilians had been killed. It was an act completely without parallel in modern warfare. It was literally the first atomic bomb. You would have expected that they would have thought, we can't carry on. But this is Japan we're talking about. This isn't any other country. And so they refused to surrender on the grounds that their attitude was, well, you can keep bombing us, we don't care, we are not going to surrender to you. But of course, the problem is they didn't really understand what they were up against.
The bomb obliterated Hiroshima and its people, and yet the Japanese government still refused to surrender. 3 days later, a second bomb landed on Nagasaki.
The devastation at Nagasaki is, make no mistake, it's huge. But because Nagasaki is built in sort of valleys and it's got cliffs and things like that, the explosion was much more contained. So relatively fewer parts of the city were destroyed compared to Hiroshima. But still you have a death toll, approaching 100,000 people. It is still devastating, and it is far greater than any other single bomb can possibly produce.
Emperor Hirohito broke the government's deadlock, expressing that the Japanese race will be destroyed if the war continues. And so, on the 15th of August, Hirohito announced the end to Japan's suffering over radio broadcast.
I have received this afternoon a message from the Japanese government
in reply to the message forwarded to that government by the Secretary of State on August 11th. I deem this reply a full acceptance of the Potsdam Declaration, which specifies the unconditional surrender of Japan. In the reply, there is no qualification.
Reporters rush out to relay the news to an anxious world and touch off celebrations throughout the country.
A new wave of cruelty and devastation ended the conflict. Japan officially signed the Surrender Act soon after. Four years after the devastation at Pearl Harbor, the biggest conflict in history had finally come to an end.
In Chicago, tears of joy mingled with cheers as 1 million people sang and danced in the streets.
The surprise attack by Japan on the 7th of December, 1941, led to death and destruction on a scale never before seen in human history. The relentless fighting in the Pacific, from the beaches of Iwo Jima to the blood-soaked hills of Okinawa, had pushed both sides to the brink. The dropping of atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki brought the war to a dramatic and tragic end, sparing the world from further destruction. What began with an unprovoked assault closed with a transformed world, as the hard-fought peace reshaped nations and laid the foundation for a new global order.